I think we're live now. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mehdi Gassemi and I am Director of Research at ISTC, Lille Institute of Communication at the Catholic University of Lille, Université Catholique de Lille. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the seventh session of our annual seminar, and it's actually the last. And this year we're organizing our seminar with this Centre Internet et Société, the Center for Internet and Society, a research group of the CNRS, which is basically the National Center for Scientific Research. It is with great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Isabel Millar. I hope I'm saying it right, Isabel. Is it Millar or Miller?
It's
Millar.
Millar, but you can say it however you like.
Okay, Isabel Millar. It sounds Spanish. Yeah. Okay.
It sounds better like that, so say it.
Okay, great. Who has joined us from London. You're joining us from London, right?
That's right, yeah.
Good. So Isabel is research fellow at the Center for Critical Thought at the University of Kent and research fellow and faculty at the Global Center for Advanced Studies, where she will be teaching with their newly formed Institute of Psychoanalysis. Isabel's first book, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, which made a lot of noise, was published in 2021 in the Palgrave Lacan series, and her second book, forthcoming, Patty Politics, or Patty Politics. Which one do you call it, Isabel?
I say patty, but I quite like it when people say patty politics because it sounds like a hamburger.
It does, yeah. So Patty Politics, on the government of sexual suffering, and this one will be out soon, I think, with Bloomsbury. Today, Isabel will present a talk about sex and the singularity, AI, psychotic discourse, politics, Lacan, and all those amazing things that Isabel knows so much about. So before I hand the mic over to our speaker, we will have a Q&A session after Isabel's presentation. There is a tab dedicated to questions at the bottom right side of the screen, so feel free to post your questions there, like even during the talk, and I'll then try to take as many questions as time allows and then relay them to Isabel after her talk. Okay, so without further delay, the mic is yours, Isabel. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's so nice of you to invite me to talk. And but before I start, I realized I didn't do the checking with the minimize screen because I'm used to Zoom, and I'm going to have to check how to minimize this particular for the paper. What do I press?
So, do you see an arrow, like two arrows going this way?
This way.
There you
and
go.
if I put my I can't see any of you, but I'm assuming you can see me still.
Absolutely, we see perfectly.
Brilliant. Yeah. So what I'll just do first of all. Okay, cool. So hi everyone. So I wrote this book last year. When it came out last year, The Psychoanalysis of AI, and in which I'd sort of approached the question of artificial intelligence from a psychoanalytic as opposed to a traditionally philosophical angle. And this means that I try to answer some questions that aren't typically asked of artificial intelligence, and try to, I guess, subvert some traditional ways of thinking about the question of intelligence itself as a concept, and trying to put that in conversation with other questions to do with subjectivity, consciousness, and the body, enjoyment, suffering, sexuality, essentially. And I did this through various different sort of methodological intertwinings, sort of both sort of philosophical and more clinical, and also film theory and sort of general merging of these different forms to try and come up with a new way of approaching the question of AI. So I'm kind of, I've spoken a lot about this book, and I don't know if people here are sort of familiar already with me talking about it, so I won't go too much into the book. But what I wanted to do today is give a little paper on the new work that I'm working on at the moment, which sort of is born out of this particular concern with subverting sort of questions of artificial intelligence via psychoanalysis, and of course via Lacanian psychoanalysis. And through writing this book, you know, of course, it took me through lots of Lacanian twists and turns. And obviously, it's not just a question of subverting the questions of AI, but it's also a question of interrogating artificial intelligence, psychoanalysis, I should say, and trying to reinvigorate psychoanalysis and look at the way that the concepts need to move in step with the new kinds of questions that we have to ask in relation to the changing nature of subjectivity, the changing nature of our technological conditions, looking towards the future, looking towards other questions relating to filiation, relating to reproduction, relating to how we conceive of ourselves in relation to our bodies as we become more intertwined with various different technologies. So this was a big question that took upon various different manifestations. And one of the sort of central focuses of this was, of course, the question of sex and the question of how we think about sexuality in relation to how humans have traditionally thought of themselves as thinking creatures with bodies. And this is, of course, not a new question, and post-humanist philosophy has approached that in many ways over the last few decades. And sort of psychoanalysis has a different way of approaching that question as well. And part of my work was looking at how different sort of post-human philosophies are often getting certain questions wrong when it comes to sexuality and the body. And I found this particularly interesting via the question of the sex bot, which was this sort of focus of my previous book, looking at that concept through film and looking at the different ways that we could envisage this this concept of a non-human body, but yet that was the object or the subject of sexual desire or sexual interest for human beings. So one of the things I've started looking at since that book is a concept that I sort of came up with, Patai politics, as Mehdi mentioned, which is a concept which sort of tries to build on the biopolitical heritage of Foucault, obviously, and Akumembe and Giorgio Agamben. But instead of just looking at the sort of the question of the management of life or even the management of death in necropolitics, I'm looking at the management of suffering, patio from the Latin to suffer. So, of course, for psychoanalysis, the question of suffering is also a question of enjoyment, and it's this particular ambivalent type of enjoyment that really is the sort of bedrock of psychoanalysis and is the bedrock of the question of human subjectivity itself, which is the sort of red thread that goes through all of my work, and which was the central question of the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence. So with that, I want to sort of introduce the paper that I'll give to you now, which is sort of part of this new project. And actually, although I'm talking a lot about Lacan always, today I'm not going to speak that much about Lacan, because this work kind of builds on some of the critiques of Lacanian psychoanalysis and goes back to Baudrillard, actually, and his thinking around masculinity and femininity in relation to specifically questions of technology and questions of the Enlightenment, and his sort of later work on simulation. So I know that the title of this talk was mentioned the question of sort of psychotic discourse networks. And that was in relation to more Hitlerian, Friedrich Hitler, the media theorist, things that I was working on. So this particular paper won't be talking about psychosis per se or Hitler, but it is on the question of sex and certainly the singularity, but via Baudrillard and Lyotard, in fact. So I hope this kind of gives you a little bit more context of what I'm going to try and talk about now. So I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then if there's any questions, we can do that. Okay, so here we go. So this paper is called Can We Forget Foucault? Obscenity and the Politics of Seduction. Life is pornographic. Everything is obscene, and there is no longer anything left to secrecy. These were some of Jean Baudrillard's bold ideas in his last work about the final stage of hyperreality and simulation into which we had entered. Despite the ridicule that Baudrillard's work has attracted, his ideas were far more nuanced than just outlandish metaphysical proclamations designed to puzzle and shock. Our current sexually saturated, permanently online, existentially bereft predicament seems to suggest his diagnosis was correct. In this talk, I will explore how the notion of seduction, as Baudrillard conceives it, offers us a way of understanding the production of reality and a retreat from the obscenity of the world. Modern life gives us everywhere the opportunity to enjoy and simultaneously to witness the suffering of others. Baudrillard exposed this grimly in his much-quoted text, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, in which he claims that this war, the Gulf War, was the first conflict to be fought in hyperreality itself. Not that he was denying the many of thousands of lives lost, but that the reality of the events was preemptively and recursively determined by the media coverage, which the soldiers were having to refer to in order to know what was happening on the ground. Meanwhile, the spectators at home could watch the events unfold with all the latest dramatic editorial effects designed to make the experience more entertaining and coherent as they ate dinner or enjoyed a drink. Today, the ongoing war in Ukraine has an even more hyper-real quality, simultaneously being created and curated by social media and delivering a variety of truth effects to divided audiences across the globe. The function of war as pornographic entertainment can no longer be ignored. But perhaps we can try and understand the structural relation between reality and the pornographic via the HBO series Euphoria. Euphoria's main character, Rue, a teenage girl struggling with drug addiction and depression, tells us in the opening sequence of the pilot that, as a child, for no particular reason, she suffered from panic attacks and hyperventilation. One day, leading to her hospitalization and dependence on prescription and recreational drugs. She remarks to her drug dealer friend that the first taste of Valium gave her this sublime moment of quiet and repose from the world that ever since she'd been trying to replicate. Alongside Rue, the other characters variously struggle with the horror, ambivalence, and oblivion of sexuality. Sex for these young people is experienced by turns as pornographic, violent, abusive, and paedophilic. Jules, a trans girl, enters into an abusive sexual encounter with an older man who himself turns out to be the father of a bullish, hypermasculine Nate, who threatens to rape her at a house party shortly after her encounter with his dad. We soon learn, via Rue's omniscient narration, that Nate had discovered his father's highly organized collection of paedophilic and violent porn as a child and began avidly watching it, growing up to become sexually aggressive, misogynistic, and generally sadistic. Although Euphoria is set in the present day, it's a depiction of a nostalgia for 90s pre-social media relationships. A Mark Fisherian ontological soundtrack adds a melancholic feel of an anticipated future that never arrived. Through its explicitness, brutality, and banality, any remnant of teen romance is shown to be on its way towards disappearance into the hypersexual universe of nihilistic, permanently online, no future Gen Zers. Whilst the show may not explicitly articulate this as an absence of sex, the overriding feeling one gets from the heightened sexuality and pornographic elements of utter disaffection and alienation, an extinguishing of romantic desire experienced by each of the characters as their own unique and insufferable jouissance. The inexistence of sex is, as we know, the foundational concept of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Each subject only of experiencing sexuality as mediated through a fantasy structure in which they may take up any position in relation to the object. The tripartite formula of sexual fantasy follows the grammatical form used by Lacan and his conceptualization of the drive in Seminar 11. Lacan's move here was to conceive of the drive as something which escaped the active-passive opposition. In the case of the scopic drive, for example, he makes the simple reversal of seeing being seen dichotomy into the formulation making oneself seen. This may apply to all configurations of fantasy in terms of the grammatical form of jouissance attained through one's place in the structure of the drive circuit. But where, according to Baudrillard for psychoanalysis, there remains the possibility of a non-relation giving rise to various forms of jouissance, Even the power of this failed sexual rapport is diminishing along with the progressive abstraction of sexual exchange value. A complete dissolution of desire and eroticism replaced by something more akin to compulsion and automatic mimesis. Hyperbolic and reactionary, perhaps, but what Baudrillard recognizes is the fact that sex is itself a simulation, an attempt to replicate an originary lost jouissance that was never really there in the first place. However, he takes the idea of sexuality and its relation to the discourse of the Enlightenment further into the realms of hyperreality and ontology. Baudrillard admittedly borrows much of his conception of sexuality from Lacan, the abstraction of masculinity and femininity into onto epistemological categories and modalities of jouissance, phallic, and feminine or other enjoyment, far removed from mere questions of gender performativity. Yet he does something quite intriguing in terms of the use to which he puts the abstract notions of male and female thought. In his early period, he develops his critique of capitalism from a neo-Marxist perspective, but ultimately concludes that Marxism can't think the pre-modern outside of the paradigm of production. Ultimately, socialism, in his view, is only a slightly fairer version of something inherently alienating, the process of labor and consumption. Hence, he moves towards a theorization of symbolic exchange, for which he engages with the work of Georges Bataille, Marcel Mauss, and Alfred Jarry. In these authors, he saw respectively the concept of expenditure, the model of Desagne as endless expenditure and with no reward in Bataille's general economy, Mauss's idea of non-reciprocal gift-giving and the potlatch, and Jarry's theatre of the absurd and pataphysics, which all offered a different model for conceiving of society. This culminated in an aristocratic critique of slave morality in the tradition of Nietzsche. Following this period, he breaks again and moves to the phase of the triumph of the object, in which he theorizes technology as the dominant factor shaping social relations and culture in general. At this point, his work becomes more speculative and transitions from social theory to philosophy proper. In his last period, Baudrillard was interested in the specific relationship between the production of sex subjectivity and its relation to the paradigm of simulation. He was attempting to identify a problematic moment in technologically advanced, so-called postmodern societies at which consciousness is no longer able to distinguish between reality and simulation, when the simulation into which we are plunged becomes more real than reality. What Baudrillard terms hyperreality, a space in which the real and the fictive are seamlessly blended. For Baudrillard, reality is always mediated by a differential system of signs, which gain their value by their relationship to each other and in that sense are infinitely malleable. In the digitally mediated world, it's very rare that we experience events firsthand, but even when we do, for Baudrillard, this does not constitute reality per se. He famously uses Disney World as an example of a place that functions to make the outside world appear more real and to dissimulate the fact that the whole of America was itself a simulation. But this logic, according to Baudrillard, can be applied to all forms of social interaction and political action. Situations of fantasy are created precisely in order to cover over what we perceive as reality is always already ideologically prefabricated. This immersion into hyperreality would happen undoubtedly with the interspersing of physical and virtual realms and with the entanglement of human intelligence and AI, but for Baudrillard had already started to happen simply as a constitutive part of the process in the abstraction of symbolic systems. But what Baudrillard was particularly concerned with and found problematic within the paradigm of hyperreality and simulation was the question of obscenity. Obscenity refers here not merely to the realm of the sexual, but to the whole of the visual field, and indeed to the transparency of knowledge and the transmission of information. Obscenity had replaced seduction. Seduction is nevertheless a concept that goes far beyond sex for Baudrillard. Pornography was not merely a question of total access to the sexual body, but also more generally the obscenity and transparency of knowledge and information. Controversially, he ties this closely to the feminist movement and to psychoanalysis, which he accuses each in their own way of stripping seduction of its power as a metaphysical veil. However, his thrust here is often misunderstood. Seduction is not just a question of femininity, traditionally understood, but a game of ritual and simulation that governs politics, social life, culture, sex, and even death. In this sense, Baudrillard was continuously making the claim that there is a direct and inverse relationship between the obscenity of everyday life and the disappearance of the world. This obscenity was ultimately brought about by the discourses of the Enlightenment, be they scientific, political, cultural, or aesthetic, and the surgical, microscopic, and anatomical precision with which everything is on display, categorized, and made operational. To put it in the simplest and crudest imagery, the Enlightenment search for complete knowledge goes hand in hand with the pornographic drive towards extreme close-ups of bodily penetration. We could say that the fascination with finding the last remaining hidden spot on the human body and the endless thirst for ever more graphic and explicit forms of sexual imagery is a mirror of the scientific formalization of the universe. It's for this reason that Baudrillard takes Michel Foucault to task in his part in what Baudrillard sees as the making too explicit of the sexual realm. In Forget Foucault, Baudrillard questions the foundation of Foucault's entire oeuvre in the book he particularly has in mind is History of Sexuality 1, The Will to Knowledge. He states, Foucault's discourse is a mirror of the power he describes. Its strength and its seductions lie there, and it's not in its truth index. He goes on to say, but what if Foucault spoke to us so well of sexuality, at last an analytical discourse on sex, or a discourse freed from the pathos of sex, that has the textual clarity of discourses which precede the discovery of the unconscious, and which do not need the blackmail of the deep to say what they have to say? What if he spoke to us so well of sexuality only because its form, like that of power, is disappearing? So his contention was that sex, in the way that Foucault was describing it, was only becoming so clear as a concept because there has never truly been a sexuality. Foucault himself was in the process of retroactively creating it. Baudrillard opens his essay by stating that Foucault's writing is perfect. By this, he meant that in its ability to infiltrate and saturate every microscopic space of meaning and explicate everything without excess, acts not just as a mirror of the very form of discursive power he's attempting to describe, but as a kind of obituary, that's to say, a text seeking to give meaning to something already dead. The essay forwards a provocative claim that the possibility of Foucault's method is always retroactive, paradoxically speaking of a discursive system that by definition can no longer exist as a discourse. This is because the idea of perfection for Baudrillard is inherently oppressive. Total operativity, functionality, and self-sameness signals an extinguishing of subjective freedom. And this is something which he discerns not just in the ideas of Foucault in relation to the concept of power, but similarly in Gilles Deleuze's notion of desire and Jean-François Lyotard's libidinal economy. In Deleuze's substitution of the Lacanian notion of desire as lack with the productive immanent form of desire, for example, Baudrillard saw nothing more than an exchange of one idea for its mirror image, an all too perfect covering over of an incomplete reality. Foucault's corrective to the Freudian repressive hypothesis, the injunction to produce sexuality via forms of speech, is understood by Baudrillard, therefore, to be equally problematic. He sees Foucault's substitution of repression with injunction against talking about sex, coupled with a compulsion to confess desire, as structurally producing the same effect. He says of the book's essential idea that it substitutes a negative, reactive, and transcendental conception of power, which is founded on interdiction and law, for a positive, active, and immanent conception. And this is, in fact, essential. One can only be struck by the coincidence between this new version of power and the new version of desire proposed by Deleuze and Lyotard. Baudrillard, in contrast, sees the existence of sex as only comprehensible after the fact of its extinction. Foucault's expertise in describing it, therefore, marks its complete disappearance from reality. The proof of this disappearance, according to Baudrillard, can be found in the explosive proliferation of pornography. The arrival on the scene of the most explicit obscenity signals, strangely enough, that sex is really nowhere to be found, as if the demand to witness everything, to catalogue every possible human desire, to see it impossibly fulfilled, marks the end of a project, a dossier of failure. In fact, what better way to understand the principle of hyperreality than in the operation of the pornographic image? On the one hand, it professes to give the viewer the ultimate access to the sexual act, devoid of filters, screens, and prohibitions, yet in its very nature can only ever be a simulacra, a copy of a copy. In other words, the enactment of a fantasy that itself has no original. Baudrillard's main contention with Foucault in relation to sexuality, although many would argue this is a mischaracterization of his position, was that Foucault seems to be setting apart a notion of sexuality that could exist prior to its subsumption into discourse, as if there were some better, more liberated version of the body and its pleasures, which is where Foucault ends up at the end of History of Sexuality. But for Baudrillard, there is no such thing as sex outside of its production through progressively dispersed forms of power knowledge. And if we follow Foucault's argument to its logical culmination, eventually sexuality, once it's been fully exhausted by such discursive and dispersive networks in the form of the pornographic society, will just disappear. And according to Baudrillard, has already done so. It's this gesture that Baudrillard is really calling attention to, not because he rejects Foucault's method, but because he sees how powerful it is in its analysis of the ultimately simulated nature of sexuality. He writes, "Ours is a culture of premature ejaculation. More and more, all seduction, all manner of seduction, which is in itself a highly ritualized process, disappears behind the naturalized sexual imperative calling for the immediate realization of a desire. Our center of gravity has in fact shifted towards an unconscious and libidinal economy, which only leaves room for the total naturalization of a desire bound either to fateful drives or to pure, simple mechanical operation, but above all to the imaginary order of repression and liberation." Unquote. Essentially, his criticism is aimed at Foucault's followers rather than Foucault himself, as he acknowledges that Foucault is well aware of the truth effects his discourse can produce for those who take his text as occupying a transcendental position. This disappearance of reality that Baudrillard is attempting to put his finger on has been misunderstood by many readers, and indeed its relation to the sexual realm has not yet, I don't think, been fully appreciated. For Baudrillard, the obscenity into which we had entered through the full operationality and transparency of knowledge was the height of, to coin a phrase, instrumental masculinity, a tendency which must be resisted at all costs. The phallic desire to make everything visible, understandable, and demystified should not be, in his view, the aim of theory. In fact, in doing so, this process only ever becomes a simplification of the world. Rather, theory and philosophy should try to make the world more complex, to deepen, enrich, and create further questions, paradoxes, and mysteries. This, for Baudrillard, is the feminine thought, the art of seduction. In this way, Baudrillard, by his own definition, is a feminine thinker. Seduction, conceived thus, is the process by which a distance is inserted between the object of desire and the objectifying gaze of the subject. This can be thought of literally, as in the difference between the pornographic and the erotic image, but more conceptually as acknowledging an occulted side of an object that can never be fully apprehended, as is the case with the whole of the visual field. One can never see something from all angles at once, as this contradicts both the logic of the gaze, as the blind spot in vision from where subjectivity emanates, and the materiality of the eye as the organ of vision. So I turn now to Lyotard's essay, "Can Thought Go On Without a Body?", which draws attention to the necessary partiality of vision in his critique of the philosophers and scientists who he envisages as attempting to model artificial thought on an erroneous analogy with human intelligence. According to Lyotard, the gesture of building a simulation of vision via an abstracted view from nowhere loses the dimension of embodiment inherent to human vision. Lyotard's point in this essay, which forms the opening chapter of The Inhuman, is to put forward the provocative proposition that, given that it is an inevitability that the sun will die in 4.5 billion years, we must attempt to imagine the possibility of thought going on after the death of our bodies. But this is not like any normal death we can imagine, since even our own death would still occur within the backdrop of the existence of the species. Thinking would go on whether our subjectivity was there to know it. This type of image of death, in contrast, is one which must be thought by philosophy itself, and philosophy cannot carry on without any bodies left to think for it. He concludes, therefore, that the task of the various disciplines of neurophysiology, genetics, physics, astrophysics, particle physics, information science, tissue synthesis, etc., must be to make the conditions for thought and the material support for it possible after the solar annihilation. All other concerns, such as health, war, production, communication, being merely diversions on the way to this ultimate goal. It's this realization that forces us to think about the relationship between the hardware of the human body and the software of thought. How is this simulation possible? He writes, "How to make thought without a body possible? A thought that continues to exist after the death of the human body. This is the price to be paid if the explosion is to be conceivable, if the death of the sun is to be a death like other deaths we know about. Thought without a body is the prerequisite for thinking of the death of all bodies, solar or terrestrial, and of the death of thoughts that are inseparable from those bodies. But without a body in this exact sense, without the complex terrestrial organism known as the human body, not without hardware, obviously." Unquote. Lyotard, directing his arguments to the philosophers of AI, who would be responsible for thinking of such a form of thought that could go on without a human body, points out that this hardware is not simply one which can take any form whatsoever. In that part of the problem, as pointed out by Hubert Dreyfus, is that human thought does not function in binary mode, nor with units of information. Rather, it draws on intuitive and hypothetical configurations. And as Husserl has shown, thought becomes aware of a horizon, aims at a noema, a kind of object, a sort of non-conceptual monogram that provides it with intuitive configurations. This orientation within thought, Lyotard likens to the function of vision. A field of thought exists in the same way that there is a field of vision or hearing. Crucially, though, he says, we should not think of this analogy as merely extrinsic, but rather intrinsic, in the sense that thought must necessarily proceed analogically to the body and not logically, as with binary code. Therefore, according to Lyotard, the body must be taken as the model of thought if we are not to limit AI to the ability to reason rationally, as this would be a very poor and partial attempt to imitate human thought. It follows then that what makes the body and thought inseparable is not just that the latter cannot exist without the former, but that each of them is analogous to the other. Hence, Lyotard introduces the dimensions of embodiment, gender, suffering, and enjoyment into the purview of AI. In fact, it's striking that the essay is divided into two parts, he and she. It seems that Lyotard is beginning to factor in the possibility of the ontological structure of sexuation as a vital component for the conceptualization of AI. In the second part of the essay, she, where Lyotard begins to discuss what we could call the ontological notion of seduction that Baudrillard is getting at. As he puts it, perceptual recognition never satisfies the logical demand for complete description. Just as a visual object always only presents one side to the eye, there is always the part occulted and beckoning to be observed, but never can all parts be seen at once. The movement of vision involves the calling to mind of what was just seen and anticipation of what will be seen in order for the possibility of an identification of an object. It's this continuous seduction of the subject of vision by the object which is definitive of human thought. And here Lyotard says something quite remarkable in terms of the question of seduction. But another question bothers me. Is it really another question? Thinking and suffering overlap. Here he has in mind writers, musicians, and artists as all engaging in modes of thought that derive from a form of bodily ascesis, from a denial of gratification, a self-disciplining, and a withdrawal from the world. He says, maybe it's just a mode according to which what doesn't yet exist, a word, a phrase, a colour, will emerge, so that the suffering of thinking is the suffering of time. So the type of cognitive operation that he believes is being simulated by the selecting and tabulating of data, the overweening and identificatory processes of computing machines, can never reproduce such an emergence of thought, bereft as it is of the dimension of, in Baudrillard's terms, seduction. He says, the body and the mind have to be free of burdens for grace to touch us. That doesn't happen without suffering, and enjoyment of what we possessed is now lost. To sum up, will your thinking, your representing machines, suffer? Unquote. Lyotard posits that ultimately it's sexual difference, not as a question of anatomy, but rather as an incompleteness in thought itself that will have to be simulated for thinking to occur after the human body as we know it has gone. He says, so the intelligence you're preparing to survive the solar explosion will have to carry that force within it on its interstellar voyage. Your thinking machines will have to be nourished on the irredeemable differend of gender. So it's the politics of seduction, one which retreats from the pornographic insistence of total knowledge and perfect visibility, therefore, that both Baudrillard and Lyotard propose as a refuge from the obscenity of the world. So to return to Euphoria, if the kids of Euphoria represent the pornographic age, Rue, as the all-seeing eye and benevolent presence of the show, paradoxically stands for the empty position of the post-porn subject, a disposition towards disappearance, negativity, seduction, as opposed to production. Her love affair with trans girl Jules could certainly be read as an undermining of instrumental masculinity and the logic of phallic domination so prevalent with the other characters' sex lives. I was born 3 days after 9/11, Rue tells us in flashbacks. As flashbacks appear, planes crashing into the Twin Towers on a TV screen in the hospital delivery room. I know it all seems sad, but guess what? I didn't build this system, nor did I fuck it up, she says. This statement of nihilistic resignation perhaps serves to underline the liberal tone of the show. On the one hand, Euphoria shows us the full glamorous spectrum of debauchery, decadence, and drug abuse of Gen Z with apparently no censorious tone, but on the other, serves as perfect fodder for conservative viewers to condemn the delinquency of the progressives. In the end, though, we must ask whether Rue's retreat into depression and addiction has any redemptive value as a politics of seduction. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel. Are you done?
Yeah. I'm done.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Cheers. Thank you. Thank you for that. Was very rich and extremely dense. I did my best to keep up. That was great. So I think I can start with a couple of questions, and this will give everybody a chance to structure their thoughts, basically, and maybe start typing in the questions. Okay. So Isabel, sexual difference is really important in your work generally, and I heard that in your talk as well. So here's a general question. Thinking about sexual difference, the way Lacan basically first thought of it, and the way it's been taken up by other people, including Baudrillard that you mentioned, like concretely, to what extent is it useful for us? And this is a question that I get sometimes as somebody who reads Lacan and needs to answer the question. How useful is it today to stick to this sexual difference, the Lacanian sexual difference, to think politically and progressively?
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah. Sorry, finish. Sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. I think it's essential. I think that, especially now where we are having so many bitter arguments over the human body and over what constitutes a man and what constitutes a woman, and sort of these discussions are descending into battles between often the people who are the most vulnerable in these arguments, and all the wrong sorts of people are winning the arguments. Not to sort of get into the question of all the trans debates going on, but I think that one of the important things for Lacanian theorists and for people interested in sexual difference is that it gives you tools to think and talk about sexuality in the body in a way that, in a sense, is not really to do with gender. It's sort of something that allows us to think much more conceptually and in a much richer and more complex way about what we actually mean when we're talking about the feminine and the masculine, and hence why I mentioned, Baudrillard in a funny way is a feminine thinker. And what could that mean? Well, it means that we don't have to always be bound by the traditional ways of interpreting what feminism is. And one of the major kind of misconceptions about, for example, Lacanian psychoanalysis is that it essentializes gender, that it doesn't understand the trans body, that it doesn't embrace the non-binary person. And I think that would be wrong to think that that's what Lacanian psychoanalysis does. I'm not saying that some people don't use Lacanian psychoanalysis to do that, and I would say they would be wrong to do that. But I think what is useful is to try and understand how subjectivity is inherently marked by sexual difference, and that's the biggest lesson of psychoanalysis, is to understand that none of us are able to fully be a man or a woman, but all we can do is inhabit language in a certain way and inhabit certain structures that allow us to think about thought in a certain way. So in that sense, sexuality for psychoanalysis becomes a much richer concept than identity politics or body politics.
And you think this conception of sexual difference and the possibility of thinking feminine thought would enable us to basically go beyond Foucault and his notion of biopower? Is is this right? Am I right to think?
Well, I think that Foucault is always a sort of in opposition to Lacan, because as Baudrillard's kind of trying to say that Foucault sort of seems to be holding on to some fantasy of a pre-discursive sexuality that could exist without the sort of intermediary of power, whereas he seems to be sort of doing something that is impossible, is like trying to produce this new form of human. And I suppose Baudrillard is the person who says, well, if we take that to its limit, what do you get? You get like this absolute obscenity, this complete nothingness. You lose any form of kind of purchase on what the human is anyway. So I suppose what I'm interested in is trying to, after you take Lacan to psychoanalysis to AI, what do you how do you get beyond Foucault? How do you get beyond the question of power and AI in relation to the body? So I think there's a lot of work to do with Foucault still, but I don't think they're mutually. I don't think that psychoanalysis doesn't have anything to say to biopolitics and vice versa. I think they're useful to each other.
This is brilliant. Thank you, Isabel. I have so many questions, but I'll just start with the questions for now. I'll take a few from the audience. So Maureen asks you, what is or what would be the relationship between the politics of seduction and the notion of consent? And she says, I haven't seen the show that you mentioned, but maybe it's also thematized there.
Mm-hmm. Euphoria, yeah. So the relationship between the politics of seduction and the question of consent. Was that what you said?
Yeah.
Well, this is, I mean, probably slightly off topic, but I mean, I think that it is a very tricky and difficult question, but in a sense, it is difficult because we have this complicated question when we start talking about fantasy and desire and jouissance and unconscious and all of these psychoanalytic questions that come in when we think about what sex is and how you can never truly always just want what you think you want, etc., etc. Which we all know about sex, which is why psychoanalysis can't be the only tool that you use to talk about sexual politics. It just can't be, because if it was, then we could always find a way of sort of justifying our own enjoyments over other people's or our fantasies, or one classic argument that's always made in psychoanalysis, not in psychoanalysis, but Zizek always has this refrain of a very, very good point that he always makes, which is that people talk about as if on the question of rape, for example, as if a woman enjoyed the fantasy of rape, that therefore she would be more culpable of if she were to be attacked or abused or raped. And he says, on the contrary, it's almost worse. The trauma is worse because if you have a fantasy of something and then some body abuses that fantasy, it's the most traumatic and horrific thing that can happen to a person. So it's very, the value of psychoanalysis is to show that, yes, desire and enjoyment is complicated and devastating, but that does not in any way change the stakes of the social contract. It doesn't change such sexual politics in the sense that you don't become less culpable of something because somebody wanted you to do it. So at no point in any form of legal proceedings when we interrogate a person who's been raped, should we ever be trying to figure out whether that person wanted to be raped? And that sounds like an obvious thing, but that is what happens. That is still what happens, is that it seems to be a thing that can even be on people's minds, as if to say, oh yeah, but maybe, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, even if, the point is, it's about the person, it's about the perpetrator. It's never about the victim. But we don't have that. We still are sort of locked in those old ways of thinking. So that's where psychoanalysis is very useful, because it shows you how, yes, you're guilty of your desires, but if we acknowledge that and we're more open about what sex actually is, we will have a much more civilized way of dealing with all the complexities that it brings, because it's never just as simple as we think it is.
Yeah. So just to follow up, so if there is an ethics out of this, how would you situate it vis-a-vis Lacan's famous ne pas céder sur son désir as an ethics of psychoanalysis? Would that be following up on Lacan's famous sentence on I don't know how it's said in English, don't give ground to
relative to your
desire. So I'm just thinking, it's I don't know if my question makes sense, but is there an ethics that comes out of this way of looking at the question of rape, for example, or consent?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, again, it's, so the ethics of psychoanalysis in terms of the ethics of the clinic are sort of by definition different from the ethics of politics, as it were, because what happens in the clinic stays in the clinic, but in the sense that an analysis has to be within its own framework. It has to always maintain this sort of microcosmic existence that is separate from the outside world, in order for it to maintain its power. The analytic relationship, the transferential relationship, has to have this certain ethics of allowing speech to occur and allowing somebody to understand their desires, to to put it in sort of pedestrian terms, to come to terms with their suffering in a way that allows them to love, work, and desire. So every person in an analytic situation has the right and I suppose the duty to speak freely in order to achieve any form of benefit. If, again, we don't use that term in clinical psychoanalysis, but for it to work, you have to speak, and you have to speak freely, and along that way, you're going to say terrible things, and you're going to think terrible things, you're going to feel terrible things. And some people's terrible things are going to be much more outside of the purview of ethics that we would accept, and others are going to be, more understandable. And so the point is that the ethics of psychoanalysis says you have to be able to go there, you have to be able to think it, you have to be able to say it. But along that journey, you also have to be aware that you live in a society, and these two things have to be held in tension at all times. So the ethics that can come from psychoanalysis have to kind of be aware of this paradox, which is that when you really start to unpack things, you're probably going to find things that you don't want to know. But that's the nature of all human subjectivity, is that there are things that we don't want to know about ourselves, because that's just the structure of thought. And within that, sexuality is the sort of foundation and bedrock of all of these other forms of suffering. So the ethics in that sense is one that sort of operates on I'd say a sort of dialectic between the sort of question of the clinic of psychoanalysis as an ethics and the social contract. Yeah.
Thank you. I know I promised not to ask any other questions. So, okay. So let's go to the people. So here's a question from Joe Carlos. I hope I'm saying it right. Will gender not have disappeared along with everything else by the time thought comes to a point that it must survive without a body?
Well, this is the interesting thing. And that's why I like this essay by Lyotard, because he's sort of coming to the idea that, well, we have to think of thought as this incompleteness that is inevitably gendered in order for us to think thought at all. And he's really grappling with this idea of what is a body and how can human thinking go on without a body. And so this idea of him trying to imagine all of these philosophers of AI who try and hypothesize this disembodied thought, but he's really trying to get to grips with the sort of materiality of that, of thinking, yeah, but what do you mean by this disembodied thought, and in what sense is it a thought, and what sense would it be thinking? And so it's almost like a thought experiment in the way that he tries to imagine, well, what would the conditions be for us to not to be here anymore? And when after the sun dies, we're going to have some other form of supporting what is thinking. And so this whole idea of the question of thought being this sort of process of seduction, in a sense, which is why I find it so nice to read alongside Baudrillard, because he thinks of it as this very embodied question, this question of suffering, and ultimately comes to the point of the embodied subject as a sexuated subject, which is completely Lacanian, which is completely in step with the way that Lacan would see a masculinity or femininity being just different forms of incompleteness or impossibility within speech, and forms of abstracted enjoyment. So the question of whether a body or an embodied thought could be without a gender, I think it could be without a gender, but perhaps not without a sex, in a weird way, in the sort of Lacanian sense.
Gender can disappear, but as long as we're talking about thinking, a thinking subject, sexuation is there. There's the ground for it. That's why Zupančič talks about sex being an ontology. I think it's a foundation of your own work, Isabel. Yeah. Great. So I think we can have one more. So from Luke, who thanks you, and by the way, a lot of people have thanked you. And,
thank you.
Yeah. So regarding Lyotard, interesting that our current artificial intelligences are neural networks modeled on brain neurons, and the way these neural networks spit out answers is opaque and non-rational. So our present AI is more similar to human intuition. Is that a sort of embodiment?
Our present AI is more similar to... Sorry, I'm just trying to understand that question. My brain's not working. My neural networks are not working. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the sort of, at the moment, we have various different, obviously AI research is a bit sort of umbrella term that encompasses both kind of very sort of algorithmic abstract questions that are completely, as it were, disembodied, that are to do with sort of binary code in that sense. And then we also do have the question of the Blue Brain Project and Neuralink and questions of meddling with the actual software of the human brain and trying to replicate the physical structures of the brain. And these are very different problems in a sense of how to think about what kind of thought is involved in reproducing this as a human thought. So you say our present AI is more similar to human intuition. I mean, I don't know if that is true, but I know that it's very difficult to make a statement about the kind of grand project of AI as a whole, because there are so many different forms of what would be termed as artificial intelligence, which are completely different and open up different problems within the question. And so the book, The Psychoanalysis of AI, is trying to, I suppose, first of all, get to grips with what are the different types of problem that we might come across when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, and in what ways does psychoanalysis interact with that, and in what ways is the body implicated in this problem. So hence why the question of the object in psychoanalysis and the question of the various different drive objects of the body, and the ways in which we have to factor that in when we're talking about, for example, Neuralink, becomes very interesting, because it's a different way of splitting out the different parts of human cognition. So so the question of the drive in terms of the invocatory and the scopic is something that revolves around a negative object, which for artificial intelligence is something that I don't know if we could say that we really understand very well, in terms of how, for example, vision and the way that they try to replicate seeing objects is completely not the way that humans see objects in terms of the drive, the scopic drive.
It's like Paul Virilio's notion of vision machinique, like machinic vision. Is that really vision? Yeah. Okay. Great answer. Thank you. Isabel, maybe one final question. What do you think? You're the boss here, Isabel.
It's fine by me.
One final. Okay, so Joe, is it Joe who's asking another question? No, sorry, it's Mark Young, and he's asking you, do you think James Joyce was insane for Finnegan's Wake?
Did someone
he asked you that. But he says, Mark says, you feel free not to answer that question, but I think the question's great, though.
Yeah, so why don't I see that question? Is that not on the screen?
So you see, there's a tab, questions, at the top bottom on the right. So some people.
Right. Okay. It's okay. Yeah. So do I think he was insane? I mean, obviously, as a Lacanian, I'll say, well, thanks to him, Lacan comes up with his later conceptualizations of the Santhome, of ordinary psychosis, and of the kind of richness of the question of the structure of subjectivity. So, of course, Lacan would say, no, he's not insane. He's as insane as any of us are, because we are all essentially mad. But his structure as a psychotic person helped Lacan to understand, well, actually, we could learn a lot about the structure of subjectivity from the ways that James Joyce used his Santhome to cope with his own suffering, and to turn that into his artistic expression, and give voice to a very complex and productive subjectivity, which by no means was mad. And so I think that, you know, no Lacanian would say a psychotic person is mad. And very much, you know, this whole question of ordinary psychosis is really important for, I think, for understanding AI, and it's part of the book as well, because it gives us a very nice and more nuanced way of understanding how the body is involved in thinking, and how it's essential to understand the way that the body relates to objects, and the forms of jouissance that one gets from speech will very much determine, you know, our subjective structure. So that's the short answer of saying no, I don't think James Joyce is bad.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. This is perfect. It's 7 here. Perfect. So I always promise people that yes. So when I do the moderating, we're very on time and very punctual. So thank you, Isabel, for agreeing to give a talk. This has been absolutely a pleasure. So a note to everybody. So the talk has been recorded, and it's going to be available on the website and on the school's YouTube channel. So I myself need to watch Isabel's talk again to understand more. For that rich talk. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming in and joining us. Thank you for the questions. Hopefully, we'll have an occasion to invite Isabel here in person sometime in
That'll
future.
Be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and you're not too far, so London is a strong way. Yeah. No. Okay, so thank you, Isabel.
And thank you so much. It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.